What I was doing was wrong. I tried to warn you and tried to find a way to stop it, but it was already too late. Last night, when I disabled the cameras and left the window open, I did it knowing I was making a terrible mistake. Please forgive me." Richard felt a pang in his chest. Mrs. Thompson, despite her actions, seemed genuinely remorseful. But the damage was done, and the children were in danger because of her forgiving you. "It won't change what you did," Richard said coldly. "Harov is using those children to get to me, and you gave him the tools to do it." Sarah, who had remained silent until then, stepped in. "Mr. Marlowe, we need to know where the children are. Now Mrs. Thompson might have information that can help us find them before it's too late." Mrs. Thompson nodded weakly, knowing that her only redemption would be helping to save the children. "I know where he took them," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a property, an old house that belonged to the Harov family. He has them there." Sarah turned to Richard, who nodded with determination. There was no time to lose. With the knowledge of the location, they could organize a raid to rescue the children before Harov could carry out his final act of revenge. Before leaving the room, Richard looked at Mrs. Thompson one last time. "You stay here until the police come to get you," he said harshly. "You'll regret what you've done, but that doesn't change the fact that you've betrayed my trust in the worst possible way." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her tears falling silently as Richard and Sarah left the room armed with the information. Sarah quickly communicated with Detective Harris, and the local police units organized an operation within minutes, and soon the Marlowe mansion became a hub of activity. Despite Sarah's recommendation to stay behind, Richard insisted on going with them. He couldn't stand by while the children he had come to consider his own were in danger. The drive to the old Harov property was tense. Richard could barely contain his anger and fear. He had been manipulated and betrayed by someone he trusted, but now all of that seemed irrelevant compared to the need to save the children. He felt an overwhelming responsibility for them and was determined to do whatever it took to protect them. When they arrived at the property, the scene was unsettling. The house, once elegant, now lay in ruins, surrounded by tall, dark trees. It seemed like the perfect setting for the final act of Hargrove's revenge. Richard, Sarah, and Harris, along with the other officers, approached cautiously, knowing that any misstep could be fatal. The tension in the air was palpable. Richard felt his heart pounding. As they neared the entrance, he knew they were about to face a desperate and dangerous man, but there was no turning back. The children were inside, and he would not allow anything to happen to them. As the officers surrounded the house and prepared to enter, Richard looked at Sarah. There was a silent understanding between them. What was at stake went beyond any personal vendetta. Beyond any redemption, it was a matter of life and death, and they both knew what had to be done. With one last glance at the entrance of the house, Richard took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. He knew this confrontation would be the most difficult of his life, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Sarah, Harris, and the others by his side, he was ready to face the ghosts of his past and save the children from the darkness that threatened to consume them. At that moment, Richard realized that this was his chance to redeem himself, to do the right thing, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in his way. The atmosphere around the old Harov property was thick with tension. As if the air itself anticipated the impending confrontation, the house, once a symbol of power and wealth, now stood in ruins, reflecting the state of its owner, Viktor Harov, a man consumed by vengeance. Richard Marlowe, accompanied by Detective Sarah Carter and John Harris, moved forward with calculated steps, knowing that any wrong move could cost them dearly. The police team had surrounded the property, preparing to enter from multiple angles. Despite warnings from Sarah and Harris, Richard insisted on leading the group, heading directly to the main entrance. He couldn't stay behind while the children, whom he now considered his responsibility, were in danger. He felt that the fate of his life was being played out in these moments as they approached the house. The silence grew deeper, broken only by the crunch of branches underfoot and the whisper of the wind. Through the trees, Richard could feel the adrenaline beginning to take over his body, sharpening his senses and preparing him for what was to come. "Remember, we must proceed with caution," Harris whispered, motioning for the officers to take their positions. "Harov is a dangerous man, and we don't know how desperate he might be." Richard nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the front door. He knew time wasn't on their side. Every passing second increased the risk to the children. and the thought of something happening to them tormented him. Finally, Harris gave the signal, and the team moved toward the entrance. Richard, alongside Sarah, forced the door, which gave way with a sinister creak. Inside, the house was dark and gloomy, the furniture covered in dust and the windows sealed, letting in only a faint ray of light. Everything in that place spoke of abandonment and despair, reflecting the soul of its owner. As they moved through the main hallway, Richard heard a noise coming from one of the side rooms. He signaled to Sarah, and together they headed toward the source of the sound, remaining alert to any movement. When they opened the door, they found an almost empty room, except for an old broken-down crib in the corner. Richard's heart stopped for a moment, fearing the worst, but the crib was empty. The children must be in another part of the house. Sarah murmured, her face tense with worry. They continued moving forward, searching each room with growing desperation. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway, from which a faint glow emanated. Richard felt a knot in his stomach, knowing that behind that door lay the confrontation he had been dreading and anticipating. Without waiting any longer, Harris gave the signal, and the door was forced open. Inside the room, under the dim light of a lamp, sat Victor Harov in a chair. Beside a table next to him on the floor were Tommy and the baby, tied up with fear in their eyes. Hargrove's face was marked by years of resentment and hatred, but also by a kind of sinister calm that could only come from someone who no longer feared the consequences of his actions. Harov, Richard shouted, moving toward him, but stopped when he saw Harov raise a hand, pointing a gun in the direction of the children. "Don't take another step," Marlo Harov said, his voice cold as ice. "You finally come to face the consequences of your actions." Richard felt a mixture of rage and fear consuming him, but he knew he had to stay calm. Any wrong move could endanger the children. "You don't have to do this, Harov. What happened in the past, I regret it, but it's not these children you should punish." Harov let out a bitter laugh, as if Richard's words were a cruel joke. "You regret what you did. You regret destroying my life, taking away everything I loved. No, Marlo, you have no idea the pain you caused, and now I'm going to give it back to you tenfold." Sarah, moving slowly, began to edge closer from the side, looking for an opportunity to disarm Harov without him noticing. However, Harov was alert, and his gaze was fixed on her. "Don't even think about it," Detective Harov warned, pointing the gun at Sarah. "Everyone will pay for what they did to me, and I'm going to start with what you love most." At that moment, Tommy, who had been silent the entire time, decided to act with surprising bravery for a child his age. He lunged at Hargrove's arm, trying to knock the gun away. The surprise on Hargrove's face gave Sarah and Harris the opportunity they needed. In one swift move, Sarah tackled Hargrove, disarming him as Harris immobilized him. The gun clattered to the floor with a loud crash, and within seconds, Hargrove was handcuffed and placed under custody without wasting a moment. Richard rushed to Tommy and the baby, kneeling beside them. His heart was pounding as he untied the ropes that held them. "Tommy, you're safe," Richard murmured, hugging the boy tightly. "You're safe. It's all over." Tommy, still trembling from the adrenaline, clung to Richard, and for the first time since Richard had met him, the boy broke down in tears. They were tears of relief, fear, and all the weight he had carried on his small shoulders. Richard held them, feeling the accumulated tension beginning to dissipate. The baby, though frightened, was also safe in his arms. Richard felt a surge of relief and gratitude, knowing that despite everything that had happened, the children were okay. Hargrove, meanwhile, was escorted out of the room by Harris. His face was marked by bitter defeat, but also by a strange sense of relief, as if in the end, he had found some twisted peace in his capture. When the police secured the property and took Hargrove away, Richard remained in the room with Tommy and the baby, unable to take his eyes off them. Sarah approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it," she said quietly. "They're safe thanks to you." Richard nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. He had gone through so many emotions in such a short time that he felt overwhelmed, but in that moment, as he held the children in his arms, he knew it had all been worth it. He had faced his past, saved the children, and in the process found a purpose he never imagined he would have. As they left the house, Richard looked up at the sky, seeing the first light of dawn begin to break on the horizon. The darkness was finally fading, not just in the night but in his life as well. And with the children by his side, he knew that although the road ahead would be difficult, he was ready to face it together as a family. The sun slowly rose over the Marlowe mansion, illuminating every corner, with a warmth that seemed to reflect the new beginning Richard felt inside. The days of chaos and tension were behind them, and with Victor Hargrove's capture, a dark shadow had lifted from his life. However, Richard knew that the true battle was only just beginning. The battle to build a new and meaningful life for Tommy, the baby, and for himself. After the rescue, Richard spent long hours in silence reflecting on everything that had happened. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of his success and solitude, now felt different. There was laughter in the hallways, a gentle hum of life that hadn't existed before. Tommy, who was still bearing the emotional scars of his short but difficult life, had begun to open up. His eyes were no longer filled with fear, but with a budding curiosity. Lucas, babbling, happily played with a spoon, filling the space with his laughter. Richard smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had never experienced before. He had spent so much time focused on his business, on accumulating wealth, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Now these children had taught him something no financial transaction could offer: the true value of human connection, of family. "Today is a special day," Richard said, addressing Tommy, who looked up from his plate with curiosity. "I want to talk to you both about the future." Tommy nodded, listening intently. Despite his young age, the boy was perceptive and understood more than Richard could have imagined. "I've made a decision," Richard continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I want both of you to stay with me, not as guests, but as part of my family. I want to adopt you to be your father, if you agree." Tommy stared at him for a moment, processing what Richard had just said. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from fear or sadness, but from relief and hope. Without saying a word, Tommy stood up from his chair and ran to Richard, throwing himself into his arms. Richard hugged him tightly, feeling that this small gesture spoke more than 1,000 words. "Does this mean Lucas and I are going to stay here forever?" Tommy asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Tommy," Richard replied with a lump in his throat. "It means this is your home now, and it always will be. We are a family." Lucas, who didn't fully understand what was happening but sensed the emotion in the air, began to laugh, and his laughter spread to Richard and Tommy, who joined him in a shared laughter that filled the kitchen with a joy Richard had never known before. Later that day, Richard met with Sarah in his study. She had been a constant and reassuring presence over the past few days, and her support had been crucial in overcoming the challenges they faced. He knew that without her, he wouldn't have made it this far. Richard began with a mix of gratitude and sincerity in his voice. "I want to thank you for everything you've done. Without you, I don't know how I would have managed to face all of this. You didn't just help me save these children, you also showed me that there's more to life than work and money." Sarah smiled, her gaze soft and understanding. "Richard, it's been a difficult journey, but I'm happy to have been able to help these children. They found someone to trust in you, and that's the most important thing." Richard nodded, knowing that what they had shared during this time was special, but also knowing that his path now needed to focus on Tommy and Lucas. "Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always be a close friend to us. You've been a light in a dark moment, and we'll always be grateful to you." Sarah, understanding the meaning of his words, nodded with a warm smile. "I know, Richard. I'm sure you'll be a great father to them, and though our paths may be different, I'll always be here if you need me," with a hug that sealed their friendship. Sarah said her goodbyes, leaving Richard, Tommy, and Lucas to begin their new life together. The days that followed were filled with changes, but this time they were welcome changes. Richard began the legal process to adopt Tommy and Lucas. It was a long and complicated process, but with each document signed, he felt he was one step closer to solidifying the family he had found. The Marlowe mansion, once cold and empty, transformed into a vibrant and lively home. The rooms that had been vacant were now filled with toys, laughter, and memories in the making. The rigid and opulent structure of the house softened with the warmth of the new life. It was finally the day when the adoption papers were approved. Richard and the children went to the courthouse for the official ceremony, and although it was a simple event, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another when the judge signed the final documents. Richard felt a surge of emotion. He was no longer just a lonely millionaire. He was now a father, a protector, someone who had found his true purpose in life. Upon returning to the mansion, the family celebrated with a simple but meaningful dinner. As they sat at the table, Richard couldn't help but smile as he watched children laughing together, enjoying the meal and each other's company. Tommy and Lucas were his family, and that gave him a peace and satisfaction he had never known before. That night, after putting the children to bed, Richard sat in the living room gazing at the stars through the large windows. He reflected on everything that had happened, from the cold night when he found Tommy and Lucas on the street to the moment he decided to adopt them and give them a home. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were challenges to face, wounds to heal, but he was ready to face it all with them. The trust and love they had begun to build together with a solid foundation on which their new life would rise as he prepared to retire for the night. Richard took one last look around the mansion. He no longer saw a monument to his success, but a home filled with promises. He smiled, knowing he had found something far more valuable than anything money could buy alongside Tommy and Lucas. Richard embarked on a new chapter of his life, one filled with hope, love, and the certainty that no matter what the future held, they would face it together as a family. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated on more stories filled with emotion and drama. See you in the next chapter, where we'll continue exploring lives, emotions, and the magic of storytelling. Until next time.